that's why we would not necessarily understand it. And so when we begin to understand that, this is what we have in that place. And so kind of more kind of, suppose, academic approach towards it said only one biblical book, the book of Daniel, belongs to the genre of literature known as apocalyptic. And so it derived from the Greek term apocalyptic, which means the revealing. So when we talk about apocalyptic, we're talking about God revealing something in history. And that revealing is something that brings the end of time. And it's to dealing with the end of historical time, beginning of a new world order. And they're concerned with eschatology. Do you remember Bush Sr. used the language new world order? When he used that term, it in the church, it got people kind of edgy. What do you mean by that? But it has apocalyptic language in its new world order. And however, what apocalyptic literature is concerned with eschatology, not all eschatological literature is apocalyptic. So we get that in and outside the Bible. So there's some points that distinguishes it and makes it what it is in that sense. Okay, so there's some points that we're going to look at in there. So we got Deuteronomy, the most apocalyptic works attributed to important figures of the past. So when we look at apocalyptic work, it looks backwards, what's looking forward. Then we have point 2, mediated, which is revelation through the heavenly messenger. So you have somebody from the transcendent, the other world comes into this world and communicates with this world in what we have. So though you have it in dreams, Hosea said, in the last days I shall pour out my spirit. And then you got this dream that takes place and that humankind will do. So this, then we have, for example, with that, you'll have Jacob's ladder. Jacob has a dream. Joseph is a prime example of this kind of otherworldness and dreaming that takes place. So then we have the symbols that takes place and how that's in play. So symbolism takes place, and with the symbolism that takes place, what we get in that narrative is that the symbols all mean something. They're not just there just for their sake. They mean something when we're talking about symbols. So the symbols represent something, they mean something, they speak about someone, they speak to someone. So when they talk in symbols, they're not the same as Proverbs. The Proverbs is what Jesus spoke in, but symbols are different. They say something, they have a meaning, but they're not clear as you would have it be with something else. So that's symbols in that sense. Okay. And then we have catastrophe. So things that are happening. So let's take what's happening now. You have the images that are used. You have signs. When you have strange terms in weather. Let's say, for example, it snowed in summer. We see it as a catastrophe because the date is out of sync. Then we have these ideas of dualism. Humankind is naturally wicked. So there's two groups. There's a righteous and the unrighteous. And in this language, the minority is a righteous, the majority is an unrighteous, and the majority will die and go to hell, and the minority will be saved. So it's not a case of when we all get to heaven, when the day of rejoicing it will be. In this language, what you have, there's this kind of polarized ideas. There's the good, the bad, there's the evil, there's the righteous, there's light, there's darkness, there's life, there's death. There's this thing that takes place. Then there's also the divine king. In the world, when Daniel 2, we're dealing with empires. And this, everyone should remember this, divine king. The divine king supersedes the empires. And so therefore he's sovereign. And when he comes, he dethrones the kings of history and brings an end to it, and is sovereign and brings them to an end. It's the mystery of who he is that brings an end to the wicked. Then there's the 6.7, the mythological events, and that incorporates mythological themes, battles of deities, that's portrayed in the final battle. So there's you get this idea where trying to think some movies like that, the Troy, the Trojans. That's kind of idea, this kind of elements of externalism that takes place. And then you got judgment and life after death. In the early text of Judaic or Hebrew language, you lived on for your children. So you need to have a son because your son lived on. And if your son didn't have a child, you'll get it in certain texts. Your son would have to, the next son would have to marry the wife of the one that didn't give a child. In our culture, they would probably find that very abhorrent to have to marry your brother's wife if he died. But it was part of continuing the seed. But when we get to Daniel, his idea of life after death begins to bring a different image, because you was not judged and punished in this world only, but you were judged, you were determined in the world to come. And so we get this idea that after this life, this is not it. This is not it. This is not the finish. And then we get to the last point of despair and hope. For the righteous, they see no hope in this world. So look at the people who have been wrongly incarcerated, wrongly treated, misjustly treated. In this world, there seems to be no sense of righteousness, no hope for them. And look at those who carry evil or practice evil, who do the things that they do, and they seem to prosper. In this idea of eschatology, in the end of time, they will be punished. And therefore, then, they are punished and the righteous are saved. And the last part of the sentence here, there's the apocalyptic genre consists yet of more response to a traumatic events, crisis, and disappointment of Israel's history. So Israel is taken into captivity, mistreated in some diabolical ways. They said, God, can you really be God that allowed this to happen? And so this idea of unveiling says, that's what you think. In the end, watch and see what God will do. Okay? And so we're going to put the book of Daniel, of the first one. So Daniel's made up of 12 chapters, 2 sections. Bergman summarizes it now. This is a very important part. He says that truth speaks to power. If one thing we can underline in the book of Daniel is that truth speaks to power. That same narrative, that same language exists today. The church must be the truth that speaks to the bigger picture, the power. The church speaks to power. Truth speaks to power. And in Jesus's time, remember, he's been tried by Pontius Pilate. He said, what is truth? But here in Apocalyptic, in this structure, truth speaks to power. So it's broken in 2 sections, chapters 1 to 6, dated the 3rd or early 2nd century before Christian era, and generally accepted that they would expand by addition of the visions in chapter 8 and 12. And so John Collins, Irish scholar, has this particular way how he looks at the text. And generally per se, most scholars have that same idea. They may differ to some points, but generally per se, that's just what it is in that context. And so there we have it. So let's look at the Babylon Kingdom. The extent of the Babylon Empire starts at the end of this particular reign. And if you look at what it is, Hambura's reign is what we call Iraq, Kuwait sort of thing that we have. That's the image that we get in it there. And so when we see that image that we have there, you can see also when we look at the narrative, some interesting rivers. Mouse on there. Those rivers are important because in the Garden of Eve, paradise, these are rivers that were relevant to it, to the 4 rivers. So we have this idea, and Babylon comes, and we're going to, as we dig into this a bit more, we'll see where we go with this. So those are important parts. And as we can see, here it is, and it takes this region and begins to have a great power and stretches its power. Yeah. So Babylon, the empire covers the period 1859 to 539 BC. Babylon, lying in the Euphrates, just southwest of Baghdad, was but one of many urban communities that arose in southern Mesopotamia during the 3rd century, what we call the Bronze Age. I don't know if you remember the time when Saddam Hussein, and we're going to go into the Gulf War, and many people thought, oh, this is the Antichrist, because it's Babylon. Babylon is coming back to the forefront again. And they were called Ammonites, and they were listed in the nations in the Old Testament in Deuteronomy. And so we see that the founding part of the king there, he was a great builder and a social reformer. So he took it from small coastal villages and made it into a greater place. And in Babylon, education was important within the culture. The term eduba was used to identify such learning institutions. They covered a range of things from maths through to music. They covered, so like now we said education option plan B, then education was absolutely important. It was a priority, and it stretched into quite a deep way. And the school days were long, so like we go to school late and finish early, right? It was from sunrise to sunset, starting at an early age straight through to adult, and it was strict. And you could beat the children in those days, and you can bet it wasn't nice, or adults, it was a matter of fact, nice for them at that time, but education was priority for them then. And we'll see how we expand upon that a bit more now. But upon completion of the education in Scribbler School, there was an opportunity to continue high levels of learning. And divination, the communication with the God was one. Now, we put that in church culture now. We go into tongues and we said, the devil's a liar. We don't go into those kind of teachings. But for them, this sense of being able to reach with the extended outer world was important. Bryce says the practice of magic and prophetic readings, the outcome of particular events can be predicted if one knows the outcome of a similar event that happened in the past. So they were driven by the need to know this deviation that we said we speak to other realms, we see signs, we do things. So you go to Blackpool and you go there and it says you go to Blackpool and they have lots of people who can do your reading for you. You see a little gypsy van, come inside and read your hand, or read your future, or read something in a cup until they say, sorry, we're closed due to unforeseeable circumstances. This is not the same as that. This is, they took this very serious, and the people who could read into the future, who could dream and interpret, they were of a high level. And it says, and such were called determined matters of personal thought to a kingdom. It was including animal sacrifice, how animals behaved, birds change the pattern of weathers strangely. This was important, and this presents a backdrop for Daniel's entrance into the platform as Yahweh versus eschatological prophet. So Daniel now then is a prophet. He stepped into the scene where a nation itself practices the way that it communicates with the gods, with the divine, in this way as an academic learning process, practical and theoretical. They studied it, they mastered it completely, and Daniel sets into this setting of these people who have this ability. As we go on the flip side of this here, it said, during COVID, I brought this from Reuters. It said the New Delhi Reuters said that in a Golden Hue office desk and a peacock feather ball, the Indian mystic healer, astrologer Sanjay Shamara is busy offering his clients to peek into future COVID-19 pandemic. He's muddied their past. Right now, people are really frightened about their future, he says, with flowing long hair in his forehead, his modern instant stick and apple top on his desktop. How will they survive? Will they get jobs or not? Will their business survive or not? Now, here's a point. Indians are flocking to astrologers, tarot readers, and faith healers as they seek to know what lies ahead and find the current health situation. Financial and mental problems in the country where coronavirus cases have rocketed to 3.3 million, the third highest in the world, with more than 60,000 deaths. This is a scene that you'd have in the Babylonian writing. You have a crisis, you have a need to talk to the gods. Deviation must take place because now then it tells us what's happening, and as then as now. And I'm sure that even though Rogers has put this about India, I'm sure that this is happening around the world in different places as well. So we see a crisis, we ask, which we have no control of, so we must ask outside of our control, a divine realm that we can find out what's happening. And so you would have had the same thing then as now. So Daniel the prophet, who was he? So some argue because the rise of Daniel cover roughly about 70 years. And so by the time he gets in the lines, then he's probably 80. So you know, but we come to that later on, not in this session. But some argue that Daniel is a name for a collection of writers rather than one person. So it's a pseudonym. So it's not just Daniel, a person, but Daniel, and almost like an institution that's writing these narratives. And then some argue that Daniel is just one person. So the name means God is my judge, and then there are different interpretations of that. Unlike his contemporaries such as Jeremiah, Isaiah, Daniel, through prophecy, it doesn't say, thus says the Lord. So when Daniel prophesies, Jeremiah says it, Isaiah says it, Ezekiel says it, all of the prophets, they said, thus says the Lord. But it doesn't do that. He's like Joseph, a dream interpreter. And he's mentioned as righteous sage in Ezekiel. And following the conquest of Israel, taken into captivity Nebuchadnezzar by Babylon. During this time, he serves the king who becomes his successor. His time of service lasts until the end of Babylon conquest and the Persians takes over. All that period is there. And through his time, Babylon remains his time in Babylon, he remains faithful to Yahweh, the God of Israel. Simply, he does not compromise. When we get to the book of Revelation, we'll see the biggest threat to the church in Revelation is compromise. Like in Daniel, Daniel does not compromise. Like in Revelation, the church doesn't compromise. Like today, the church is called not to compromise. And that's something for us to have food for thought. So Daniel is righteous because he does not compromise. He's in Babylon, but trusts God enough not to compromise. Not to now, there's the strange thing about Daniel is this: in every other person that you get, apart from Melchizedek, memory serves me right, there's always the son of. You have a genealogy. Daniel has no genealogy, no parents, and it is strange because it's not like any other prophets. We do not know. We know that his royal lineage, therefore, it must have been of the line of Judah, because we get in Daniel. The king commanded his palace masters, Ahasuerus, to bring some of the Israelites to the royal family and nobility, and so we know that there is in that lineage. Interestingly, in Judaism, he is not seen as a prophet, but mainly as a maintainer of God's moral law and a Babylonian statesman. So, only in Christianity is he seen as a prophet. In Judaism, he's not, as he doesn't sit amongst the prophets. Okay, because of the style of writing, scholars such as J.J. Collins contest that Daniel is really a fiction figure as a book of cryptics. So he has a different kind of idea that, you know, Daniel is a fictional person, but outside the Protestant Bible, Daniel is recorded also in other apocryphal writings that we have, Susanna, Bell and the Dragon, and so that we have that. You're going to get more your kind of Catholic writings that you have. You'll have that where he's seen expounded narrative about him in those other writings. Okay, Daniel is a political prisoner of Babylon. The book opens with him carrying the people into captivity and a batch of young men taken to service, the chief of eunuchs. Now, here's a very interesting point. The Hebrew word zaris can be used to mean emasculated male. The emasculation of males who entered into service within the king's palace for duties of religious government rules and were in contact with the king's harem. So a point to note that the term Aris also means one who's emasculated. As an example, we find it in Potiphar. So Potiphar, the term for him, the Hebrew word is the same word. Now, maybe not, he himself had been castrated. I'm not too sure. But the act of emasculation was prohibited in the law of Moses, and eunuchs were not permitted to participate in religious community. No one whose testicles are crushed or his penis is cut off shall be admitted into the assembly of the Lord. Deuteronomy 23 verse 1. That's the New Standardized Revised Version edition. And so what we get is this, begin to work things through. And this is important because it says that the idea of this being a punishment in Israel is prophesied. So the idea of Daniel being castrated is part of prophecy, because it says, some of your sons who are born, you shall be taken away, and you shall be eunuchs in the palace of Babylon. That's in Isaiah and 39 and 7 in 2 Kings 20. And also Isaiah 56, 3-5 says, do not let the foreigner join to the Lord, joined to the Lord, say, the Lord will surely separate me from his people. And do not let the eunuch say, I will give them everlasting name, that they will not be cut off. So what you get here is two things. Firstly, is that you get the idea of the culture of a man coming into the king's palace, as you did get in the text, he would be immediately emasculated, castrated. And then you get the idea that the same word, when used, let's say in part of a situation, that it wasn't, that use it in the same context, then so it might be an issue to consider. I'm going to come to that point in a second. And there's a counter argument that the king chose unblemished men, and the scriptures makes no case that this had happened to Daniel. And Jesus said in the gospel that men chose this kind of emasculated or eunuch lifestyle. So you'd get it for the gospel's sake. A typical example of eunuch lifestyle would be your Catholic priest today. So they would be seen in that sense. Let me just go and play a bit with the text. If in Potiphar's narrative in Genesis 39, that Potiphar comes in, is given a high office in Egypt. He's married, but a prisoner of war, and then he's castrated. Maybe, I'm not saying this is a point, maybe Potiphar's wife, out of frustration, goes for Joseph, because sometimes we get to look back at the text and just see what's happening in the text because of the word that's used in language, limitation of the word. So sometimes we have to look at the text and see what's happening. So who's in overview? He's lineage of David, royal blood. He's a young man, a royal family. He's noted to be good looks and wisdom, same as Joseph. Such wisdom that in prophets Ezekiel makes note of him. And also when Ezekiel speaks, he says, you are indeed wiser than Daniel. No secret is hidden from you. And that's when he's rebuking the king. He's playing of words. And so that he's given a name by the Babylonians, meaning Bel, protect him. Belteshazzar, Bel is the Babylonian god. And Daniel's prophetic writings is a way of dreams, interpretations that others can't. An interesting point to note is there are other writings, someone else, Daniel's, aka the Dreams of Daniel, a book written in Latin, and it was a manual that was written to actually in the Middle Ages of how to interpret. Sorry, my typo there. How to interpret dreams. So that was a book that was in place. He's noted for his righteousness and unwilling to compromise. He was a chief prefect over the wisdom of Babylon. He held the office with them, and he oversaw the office with 4 kings in his time, all listed here. And his life in Babylon covered an entire period of about 70 years. Then also, an interesting point, the angel Gabriel and Michael, who become prominent figures in the New Testament, are first introduced scriptures. Let me meet everybody, please. First introduced scriptures in Daniel. So the idea of Michael and Daniel, Gabriel and Daniel, Michael the fighter, Daniel, Daniel, and sorry, Michael and Gabriel the messenger, Michael the fighter, they are first introduced to scriptures in book of Daniel. So we know them in that heavenly body. When you study something like angelology, that's when you begin to see who they are. So understanding the book of Daniel, the chronological order. So chapter 1 to 4, the captivity, interpretation of dreams, 7, the 4 beasts, the ram, the he-goat, Belshazzar feast at Babylon, then vision 70 weeks, Daniel, lion's den, Daniel's prayer and vision. The point to note that the writings in chapter 2 to 4 and 7 and 8 books are in Aramaic. Usually the focus is to get it to a different audience, to Gentiles, and the rest of it is in Hebrew. So that's just a kind of summary to get us into understanding the book. So chapter 1 represents a loyal Jew living in Babylon, was in exile amongst idol worshippers. He refuses to bow down to any other god, observes dietary laws and prays facing Jerusalem. He occupies a position of some honor. He has power to interpret the dreams and predict the future, and thoroughly, severely tested, remains true to Yahweh, who aids him more than one miraculous escape from danger. What's important here is that the capture of Israel by Babylon is seen as the Babylonian god Moloch's victory over Yahweh. So understand this point. When a nation was conquered, it wasn't seen as just the mortals, but it was seen as the divine gods who were fighting. And because they were the protector of the people, when the divine God, when that nation won, not just that nation won, but their God won also. So here they are. Even though it's prophetic that they would go into captivity, it's seen that the gods of the Babylon God has had victory over Yahweh. Yahweh has been defeated. Babylon would have said that our God has defeated your God. Now, here it is. It seems like God is defeated. However, it's through his dreams that he shows that he is sovereign. So understand the narrative. The picture is Yahweh has been defeated. But now then a dream comes and Yahweh said, I'm going to show you who I am through dreams. And so he has a dream. And Nebuchadnezzar, I won't read all of it, but I want to pick out some salient points in it. So we get in the first point the time when the dream takes place, and then he calls his magicians and everything together. He asks them, "Can you interpret the dream? But you tell me what it is." And then there's a decree which would come out from here, verse 4, that those who did not know to interpret the dreams, they would be faced with some challenges in their life. And then then they can't interpret it. They call Daniel, and he says, I'm going to interpret it for you. It says, you are looking, O king, and lo, there's a great statue. The statue is huge, it's brilliant, extraordinary, was standing before you, and its appearance was frightening. Now, he goes through, he said, the head statue was made of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thigh of bronze, its legs of iron, and feet partly clay, of iron and partly of clay. Now, you know, in this last part in clay, it's not in the text, but some argue that the interpretation for the word clay is not clay, but it's tin, because they argue that every single part of the body, the statue, is a metal except this part. And maybe the word is tin, but that's a text of slightly away, but we have that picture that's there. And it says, and it's broken them into pieces, and the iron and clay and the bronze, divided in silver, were broken to pieces and become like a clay from Shara. And we have all that part there. And so we have this taking place. It said, this is the dream. Now I will tell the king its interpretation. So it tells the king firstly what he sees, which in the previous slide the king wouldn't say. And then he said, I'm going to interpret what you saw. That's interesting in comparison to modern days. Usually we have somebody speaks and someone interprets, but here he has the gift to both see and interpret, because the image is strange. And the fact a stone comes from heaven and strikes it, and it fills up the entire earth, it says, what does this all mean? Now, the strange thing is here, this would not have been his first dream. But this dream was very, very powerful. And he says to him who it means. He said, I tell you the king's interpretation, who the God of heaven will be. And it goes through all these things. We get it in the text. Really, you've done it for your homework, hopefully. But here we have, it defines what each part means. So gold. So notice the purest of it is the Babylonian part. From this area region also is where we get Abraham probably coming out of Ur. So you probably get, but you get this pure gold. Then you get silver. Here's a strange thing. These two do not rust. Gold and silver can't rust. But they're inferior as you come down. Then bronze, the Bronze Age. So we get the Babylonians, we get the Median Persians, we get the Greek, Alexander the Great. And then we get the nation that we're most influenced by in the West is the Roman Empire, the Iron Age. That is the period of violence. The Romans, they started before that. They probably started just after the about 200 years, 270 before, but they really became an empire with slip me now, Augustine. So Augustine makes it into an empire. And so we get in that period. And then the end time, iron and clay, which we don't know, but we're going to look at that slightly in a bit. Because the end part now, that's where we get the deeper kind of dialogue that takes place, because we have between what we think now and what they saw then and what was understood then and what scholars interpreted to be also. And as we get through this, Daniel interprets this, and it's a trustworthy interpretation. Because of time, I'm not going to go through the whole text, but hopefully you've read it all. Notice this now. Verse 1 is important. God becomes monotheistic. Then Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate before Daniel and paid him honor and ordered that an offering of incense be presented to him. And the king said to Daniel, surely your God is God of gods and the Lord of kings and revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery. 1 second. Now, do you remember those of you in the first sessions? Remember I said to you, we deal with God historically. You got polytheism, so there's multiplicity of gods. Then you have henotheism, that you have a God superior to any other God. There's no God like Jehovah. It's henotheistic language. But then you get monotheism. And here's a point where monotheism in the language starts coming. God is the God. In other words, it starts and ends with him because he is Lord of kings. So he's the God as Lord of kings and the revealer of mysteries. Those things no other God could do. Remember I said back to you, deviation was what they learned in Babylon, and all of their training that they committed to did not allow them to perceive, conceive, interpret, or understand what was taking place. And so Daniel's God is the God that spoke then, that was the revealer of things. That's a message for the church now. Our God now must be the revealer of things, must be the God that speaks, that causes authority. Remember, it's about truth speaks to power. And notice this, Babylon, the king, has everything, and he fell prostrate. The capture fell prostrate before the captured. The king fell at the feet of the person, some would argue, who he had castrated. It's strange imagery that takes place. Take a snapshot then and ask who's a king. You would be confused because a king would never bow to anybody. So then in chapter 2, we have the statue, the torso that takes place in the chapter, and we have the interpretation. And then in this it says, let me just go back a little bit. Firstly, sorry. Can you go back? No, it's not going back. Sorry. I do apologize. Into it. Where we were about here. Good. So I want to just pick up here. So we pick up from here. We have the torso and each metal. So we deal with this part here. So in chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream as a huge statue, the head and torso, arms and belly, and all that, and a great stone cut by human's hand, not cut by human hands, flies from heaven, smashes into clay the statue. The statue crumbles, the stone becomes a mountain that fills the earth. Daniel decodes the dream, historical symbolism. Each metal represents a kingdom that ruled the ancient Near East. Daniel explicitly decodes only gold. It is Babylon. One may suppose then that silver is medium, bronze in Persian, iron is the Medians, the Macedonians and the Greeks, which conquered the Near East under Alexander in 332. So, and that initiated what's called a Hellenistic period of Near East history. Now, let me just go to this very part here before we come to Roman history. Hellenism is where the Hellenistic period is where the East meets the West. It's where they begin to exchange cultures and ideas and thinking. And Alexander, you know, lives a short time. Is like the life of Jesus, only 30 so much years. But when it comes, he conquers in such a way that that he merges worlds together. He merges worlds together. And so we get that. And then this idea that he conquers becomes part of the history that is now in our understanding. Because now then, he makes, at this point only, do we begin to get a westernized interpretation and understanding of the East. So Alexander ushers us into that understanding. Okay, and so after Alexander's death, his empire was divided into smaller Hellenistic kingdoms. Egypt ruled by the Ptolemies and Assyrian ruled by the Seleucids, that wrangled for control of the land, with including Judea. Thus, the iron, the clay of Daniel's statue seem to represent a lesser Hellenistic kingdom. The stone from heaven represents the future kingdom of God, of heaven, that will destroy all the godless kingdoms that fill the earth. Now, Grafton says this: the interpretation of the fourth kingdom, strong as iron, but the feet, toes, and clays are partly of iron, shall be divided into kingdom, believed to symbolize the kingdom of Rome. Now, that his argument here is important, and this is where I kind of struggle slightly, because when you come to this particular point, and if it's Rome that he's talking about, then when he's talking about Rome, the problem you have with this narrative, whilst talking about Rome, is how does Rome continue? Because one of the arguments we get now is that Rome represents a continuation of what was before and what is now. Do you remember World War II? And when we had that, fascism, we saw also the rise of Rome or Italy. So Italy and Rome must be understood separately, because Rome is the Roman Empire is birthed out of Rome, the Seven Hills, and the twin brothers who come out to that point. And so when he begins to argue this point, that's where the difficulty comes, is because he's saying that Rome now then, it may have died as a kingdom, but not really. It's continuing into the feet. And that feet that we look at, to some extent, is interpreted and understood in our context now as being Europe. Now, why Europe? Well, most of Europe was influenced, has been under the influence of Rome. The things that we have, that we say, lots of things that we do are Roman things that we do. Now, the problem that we have with this particular argument that we follow is once we come through this, we then begin to ask if Rome died or finished as a nation of people in about the 3rd, 4th century, and they lost their power by then, how does it then continue? And I've not put the slides here because I didn't want to go into that too much, because a lot of scholars now then argue that it continues not through the fighting of weaponry, not through the fighting of swords and conquest through power, physical power, but now fights through a different avenue, through what we would call through the mind, through the spirit, through the teaching, through the belief system, through the church. And so the Roman Church is then the continuation of the Roman Empire is seen to continue through the church. And so therefore then we get an understanding to some extent that when we begin to talk about the last part of the statue, so that is a difficult part to look at here, is what do we actually mean by that? Because we can say that, you know, it's part of Egypt, part of Syria. We can say that, and that has a valid point, and how they would have understood at that time. But the mere fact that we are in what's called a Hellenistical period, which is the last part where East meets the West, and in meeting those two periods to come together, what you then get is a merge of two thinkings and two interpretations of the same thing. Once you get to those two metals at the bottom, you get mixture of metal and clay. Metal and iron and clay don't mix. Yet somehow they mix, and the boulder comes from heaven that is not made by man and doesn't hit the head, doesn't hit the chest, or the torso, or the middle range, but hits the legs, but hits the feet. And the feet symbolizes upon which we stand. So it doesn't matter how strong you are, the feet. They say this, if someone's going to die, when they're dying slowly in life, the first thing to go is the feet, your legs. When your legs go, then that's it. And so it hits the feet and breaks the feet. And when it does so, the entire nation is the entire statue falls all the way down, and the stone then takes complete control of the entire world. It covers the entire world. That imagery that we then get in this chapter now then begins to ask some serious questions, because if I was approached this same interpretation from a Catholic, they probably would not interpret the text that this kingdom that spans is Rome, or not as a Roman church anyway, the Roman Catholic Church, because that presents a problem, which when we get to Revelation later on, you begin to break some things down and begin to see some things that we're going to see, because later on, lots of colors come into the text, and the colors, remember symbolical language that were taking place, the colors are very important. And when we get the colors that comes into place, we're going to see symbols of the colors within churches. And ask yourself some questions there. But what becomes the point is that this kingdom is divided, and when it's divided at the end of time, we don't know anything about it. So look at the statue, going from top to bottom, we know everything about it, but the last kingdom of the feet is the one that we don't know quite what it is. We become speculative, and there are some ideas of what we think it is, but actually what it is difficult for us to understand or interpret. And so when we begin to interpret it, which I'm going to probably look at it for next week, when we begin to interpret the feet, there are a series of ideas that exist, and there's a Protestant interpretation, and there's a Coptic interpretation, and there's a Catholic interpretation. Now, the Protestant interpretation, especially the evangelical one, can cause offense when we begin to interpret it, and yet the Catholic interpretation will have a different interpretation that will not see in the same light. But whichever way it goes, I think the summary of what we understand is that this kingdom represents a kingdom of Rome, and the kingdom of Rome is already gone, then it must have established itself in a different way. I'll give an example. The ending of slavery didn't mean that slavery ended. It just meant that it repackaged how slavery took place. In the same context, if the kingdom has ended, the Roman kingdom has ended, then it must take place where it repackages its control by empire through different means. I'm going to give an example. Some of you know that I spent a lot of time back and forth in India. I remember the first time I was in India, and I said to my friend there, I said to him, right, I saw a statue of Virgin Mary. So I said, oh, this is the Virgin Mary. He says, no. I said, what is it? And he said, it's a Hindu goddess. And so what I didn't understand was that, I said to him, the difficulty is that what you see an image, and you think that image is that which you see, but then when you look closely, it's not. And so what he said to me is that the Catholicism has merged into the Hindu culture to some extent, so it stands juxtaposed, but other times there can be similarities that are not clear to see. And so Grafton is saying the same sort of thing, is that the divided kingdom symbolizes the kingdom of Rome. You think it's dead. No, it's not. It's just readjusted itself. And the question then comes, how has Rome adjusted itself to continue in this particular period in which we have? Okay. And then we take that, and when we put it back together, we'll spend a little bit more time on it next week, because next week we're going to look at just 2 more chapters to look at in the scriptures, really. But in that point is when we begin to put the points together. Now, I'm not saying who's right and who's wrong, because every scholar will interpret differently. And remember, when you look at text, it can sometimes be, especially when it's prophetic text, things to come, it becomes subjective, because you cannot pinpoint the text and say this is what it is, because it depends on which camp you're in will determine what you have an interpretation of that text. Then we get the interesting thing about this. It tells a story of Daniel's 3 companions who refused to worship a giant golden statue, was thrown into a fiery furnace. When they emerge unscathed, the king is duly impressed and acknowledges the God of Israel. Now, it's interesting that at the end of chapter 2, where we get the stone from heaven that hits the statue down, we now then get the 3 of them thrown into a furnace, and it says that there were 3, but I see 4, one like the Son of Man. That's a strange language as well we get in Daniel writing. But what is he trying to say here? Fire was 2 things in scriptures: for judgment or for purification. In the text, chapter 3, the soldiers said it 7 times higher. Numbers again, perfect heat. they themselves are consumed as they throw them into the fire. But when they throw them into the fire, the three of them in the fire are saved, and the fourth one is with them that saves them. This is important. In scriptures, there's only 4 sections that you have miracles in. So miracles are very, very rare in scriptures. I think Ezekiel, contemporaries, you have 1 and 2 there. Elijah, there you have miracles that takes place. You have miracles in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Then you have nothing again. Then you have miracles in Revelation, at a later point. But conjoining those sections, you have miracles that takes place in Daniel. So when we talk about miracles in scriptures, there's only like 4 main places where you get miracles in scriptures, but it's not as common as we would have it be. You get a little bit in Exodus, where they're fed by the birds of the air, and pattern in Exodus is your narrative from there. But generally per se, miracles are not that common. But here we get the fire, and here's a message for the church. It says, in the fire, in our refusal to compromise, we must be willing to go into the fire. But when we go into the fire, it is in the fire where God rescues us. God doesn't rescue them from the fire. He rescues them in the fire. And so now then, whilst we're in the fire of COVID, God doesn't rescue the church from the fire of COVID, but in the fire of COVID, then we get the rescuing of the church. And this idea that we get in Daniel, the rescuing, the things that begin to happen, the dreams, interpretation, this particular point is part of the apocalyptic narrative. Strange things happen, strange situations, strange circumstances. But in the midst of it, when God seems to be defeated, he shows up and shows himself God. Lastly, but not least, in the dream that takes place, the conqueror becomes conquered in his own dream, and the conquered becomes the voice of the God who seemed to have been conquered. And says, not just by that, but in the fire of who you are and what you believe, God shows up. And so now then the literature of this particular apocalyptic literature is symbolic then, symbolic now. It's symbolic later on in the when we get to the Gospels, and it sets the scene when we get to the book of Revelation. So when we finish Daniel next week and we get to Revelation, then we'll bring across some of these things that we see here across into Revelation, which is where we begin to show it much more strongly. And what you begin to see is these strange situations wherein the apocalyptic narrative shows you strange narratives, strange images. But in the midst of those strange images, God is consistently and always talking and showing himself to be God. Okay, so hopefully that's kind of done from there. Next week we'll do chapter 4, but I know it was a lot to get through today, just to dissect these points here. Because when we put the pieces together next week with the last part of Daniel, it'll get it ready for Revelation when we start it the week after. Because then now you get an understanding the literature, the end of time, the literature that's taken place, and also what it means and how we think. One last point, the book of Daniel is the last book of the Old Testament. And interestingly, it sets the scene for the new. Because in that is the image of what you call the Son of Man. And when you get to Mark, you get the language Son of Man. So in a chronological order, you get Daniel as the last book in the chronology of the Old Testament, but it sets the scenes for that for later on. Okay, so Q&As. Hopefully I've not lost anybody. But any questions that we may have, and, so we can let's just read the list.
Thank you so much, Pastor Paul, and thank you everyone for listening so carefully. Now we're going to have our question and answer time. There's a few questions that's been sent to me and I've just put them in the chat. If we do have someone who would like to ask a question, can you please indicate, can you unmute yourself? Preferably, can you send a direct message to myself where I can introduce you? But whilst we're waiting for the questions, may I just use one of the questions that was sent to us? And I'll start with the very last one. It says, why do we have to look up? So they're using a biblical term. And the question is, why do we have to look up? I presume it's about the signs that we're seeing. How is that related to what's going on now?
Right. So I will look to the hills from whence cometh my help. My help cometh from the Lord, maker of the heavens and the earth. The idea of looking up is, and it's kind of, it's almost like allegorical language, in a sense where we look up because God resides in the heaven. And so it's kind of symbolic that when we're looking up, it doesn't mean that, you know, that doesn't mean that necessarily that we're doing that way around, but we're looking up because we're looking up to God. And looking up means that we acknowledge there's somebody superior to our inferiority. Notice that when we bow down to somebody, we bow down to somebody who's superior to us, who's higher than us, and we look up to somebody who is higher than us. So that term is used in that context. And so it doesn't necessarily actually mean physically, but it can mean both and can mean an allegory as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm very conscious of time and we do have a lot of questions. Anne, can you present your question, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Mary. Good evening, everyone. Pastor Paul.
Hi.
Thank you for that teaching. Oh, I have two actually. One question is, please could you just go over why Daniel is not considered a prophet and remind me whose school of thought that is?
Right. So it's in the Judaic writing, he's not in the book of the prophets. So they don't place him in how they in the Hebrew Bible, they don't place him in that. Not that he isn't a prophet, but they just don't place him in that way around. John Collins is an Irish scholar in America, and he argues that the slides will be up on the system anyway. By tomorrow, hopefully, we've had a public glitch, but all the slides will be on for the last few weeks, so I'll put it in there. He argues that the way that the prophecies takes place, and because remember, Daniel doesn't follow a chronological order, what he's saying, and because the span of his life covers such a large period of time. Remember, Babylon conquers Israel and enters it 3 times. And in this period of time, also Jeremiah comes in as a slave in that time. And so what happens, he says, in this period of time, maybe there were people who were writing under the name of Daniel, and not necessarily him, Daniel, as a person himself, but because that there was a collection of people, he thinks, that would argue and says, I'm from the school of Daniel. So I'll give an example. Some of you might remember this when you're younger, your parents send you shopping and send you with a note to go shopping. And when you get to the shops, you sometimes, the shopping list, you'll have a shopping list, and then you'll buy something that's on the list and sometimes not what's not on the list. Here's a strange thing. Today, I just came out my house, go into the car, and in the midst of snow, I saw a yellow piece of paper. When I looked at the yellow piece of paper, it was a shopping list. Now, does it mean that that person got to shop and didn't buy what was on the list, or did it mean that they trying to remember as much as they possibly could that was on the list? And so that's the kind of argument John Collins has. He says that, you know, maybe it's a collection of people writing, not just him alone writing, and therefore then it becomes the community that's writing, because it covers a 70-year span at least. So we know, 70, 80 years span. So it's a long period of time that he argued that it could be one person writing. But then at the flip side of that, other scholars say, no. It's not that. That's not the case. We know that he'd been there for a long time, because by the time he's in the lion's den, he's probably 80. He's quite a senior person, and we know that in first part of Daniel 1, he's young and handsome. So we just know that it must have been a long period of time. And so where you might think there's different writers, they would argue, and I'd agree with that although it's a long period of time, and although the language is Aramaic and Hebrew, so there's a flip side between the two texts, what you've got to bear in mind is that probably the audience to which you're writing to was different, and therefore then you may change your language, how you write to that audience. You have that happening in the Gospels. They change how they write according to the audience and the quality of the writing between Mark, for example, and John's writing. Mark's Greek is not as polished as John's Greek, which is very much more polished Greek. And then you get bits of Aramaic in between the text. Jesus on the cross used Aramaic language. So, so Jesus would have been at least bilingual, maybe trilingual. So that's not uncommon in that sense. But you always have this in scholastic arguments about text and whether it was, that's how people make their money, by having an argument.
Thank you, Pastor.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Anne. Anne, did you have a second question, or can I ask Cam, who's waiting?
Yeah, go ahead and ask. Yeah, somebody else is fine.
Okay, thank you so much. Pastor, thank you so much for imparting all that knowledge and answering on your feet. Cam, can you present your question, please?
Okay, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay, good evening, Pastor Paul.
Right, how are you going?
I must say it's been a lot to digest this evening. My question is, would John, as the author of Revelation, have known about the apocalyptic writings of Daniel and the similarities of the prophetic messages?
Most definitely, yes. By the time you get to Jesus' writing, by the time you get to Gospels, they know about Daniel, definitely, and his image within the text is legendary. They knew who he was, and bear this in mind, in Jesus' time, the canon of the Old Testament hadn't been set. So when I say canon, meaning the accepted books of teaching, that was not in place yet. So they would have known who he was, and they would have known his writings, and they would have seen it then, thinking at statue. We at this part here, the Roman Empire part. This is what Daniel warned us about. So then, what I'd say this is that they would have thought, by the time we got around to John's teaching, he's thinking, are we at the feet now? So they would have known. I'm not saying that, that's just my argument. They would have known, but for the fact of knowing who his writing was, definitely, no doubt about it, they would have known who he was, and he would have been part of the collection of apocalyptic writers. By the time we get to John's Revelation, John is one of many apocalyptic writers, but one of the last books to be accepted in the Bible. But then that genre of his apocalyptic writing very much mirrors, to some degree, not completely, but much more intensely, Daniel's writing. So Daniel is renowned, it's very deep apocalyptic writing, not the whole thing, but just those three different events that are. But John then becomes completely apocalyptic in his writing, and his eschatological message is still the same, that at the end of time will come, and God will reign.
Okay, thank you, Pastor Paul.
No problem.
Thank you so much, Pastor. I'm going to go to one of the questions that was previously sent in the chat, if I can just scroll up. I believe it was about Daniel's dreams, and it was a question in, let me just see if I can find it, in why or how is Daniel's dreams related, and why is it important to us now that
Right.
Daniel was a dreamer?
Right, good. Now, the importance of Daniel dreaming is imperative, because I'll give an example. in the ancient Near East customs, they believed that if a person didn't dream, they were evil. And so dreaming was part of what made it was sense of purification, and so that's what they believed. And his dreams are important because they pinpoint history and the future. And so when it says it pinpoints history and the future, so for example, we get in Joel and said in the end that Joel 2 said, I will pour out my spirit. And when he talks about this, and he said, and your old men shall dream dreams, and part of the narrative that we have, the dreaming part, the eschatological, the apocalyptic narrative, part of that, even Joel, is that it's about dreaming, because God uses different mediums in which to speak, and dreaming is one of the mediums through which God speaks. Right, I'm a boxing fan. I can't remember. There's a guy called Sugar Ray Robinson. He's gonna have a fight. I forgot who was fighting, but a few days before the fight, a few days or a day before the fight, I can't remember. He has a dream. He dreams in this fight that he's fighting this man in the ring, and in that ring he kills the man. They said to him, "It's just a dream." So he said, "No. He said, I saw the fight. In the fight, I killed this man. The man I'm fighting, I saw him in a dream." He said, No. So then, after having this dream, they call a priest in. And the priest prays with him and says, "Right, no, it's fine. Let's go on. It's just your imagination playing around with you." Right, yeah. And that's it. He goes in the fight. And the dream happens. He kills his opponent in the ring. He says, "I told you I had a dream." He doesn't fully recover from that. It kind of mars his life later on, but here's a fact. He has this dream as a boxer and he sees it. In the same contents of here, the dreams become imperative and important because it not only informs you, but also it's a way of God guiding you and protecting you. And so through dreams, important then, but not in this is the biggest dream, because what happens, Joseph's dreams only was for Rome then, not Rome, Egypt then. But when we get Daniel's dream, it becomes universal, and it speaks for then and the kingdoms to come, and it speaks into now for the kingdom that has not yet come. So that's why his dream becomes so imperative. And as we begin to Revelation and begin to put the pieces together, you'll then see how the dream fits into place with John's writing and the eschatological end that we get in scriptures. So dreams are very important in what we do. Remember Jesus being untried, and Potiphar's wife said, "I dreamt this man, have nothing to do with him." Remember John the Baptist, "I dreamt." So you get this situation that dreams become relevant, become important in what takes place. It's the medium through which God speaks, and the dreams are not to be taken lightly, but they're imperative and important ways of God speaking. And in the apocalyptic language, he speaks in symbols. He gives you dreams that you think to yourself, what was that last night? But the dreams can be symbols, can be images, they interpret something. Remember Joseph and Mary. Joseph doesn't know to take Mary, but he has a dream. So dreams become imperative in what takes narrative. Don't go down to escape from Egypt, a dream. So dreams are important in scriptures. That's why the Babylonians.
Perfect.
That's why last point. That's why the Babylonians trained people to interpret to the degree that when they could not interpret the dream in the opening chapter, he said, "Kill all of them, wipe them out completely," because if they can't interpret the dream, they've got no sense, they've got no purpose. And that's when Daniel steps in.
Thank you so much. I'm now going to take another question from Anne. Anne, are you ready to present your question?
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Pastor, hello.
Mm-hmm. How you going?
Now, Pastor, I'm asking you like personally now. I don't want you to tell me anything about,
Between
pardon?
Between you and I.
No. I'm just saying, I don't want you to tell me what any other scholar thinks or whatever. I'm asking you, what or who or what form do you think the king saw in the furnace with regards to this fourth man, when nobody knew or knows what the Son of God looked or looks like? What do you think he actually saw?
So one of the things I think what you have is a Christophany. Now, a Christophany is the appearance of Christ before his birth. And we get this in, and I think this is probably one of the prime examples of it. So, and because you use the term Son of Man, and then that's a kind of other dialogue issues around that text. By the time we get to Mark, it's strongly Son of Man language. But by the time we get to Mark, and what's in Camp earlier on, do they know about Daniel? Say yes. And I think in that fire is where they see Christ prior to his incarnation, a Christophany in the midst of it, because the language Son of Man is used. So that's me as a Christian saying that. That's what I think that they saw. Other people say otherwise. But I just see that it's a divine presence of Christ in the fire. And in the midst of that fire is Christ. And in the midst of that, he said, I won't deliver you from the fire. I'll deliver you in the fire. And I think sometimes we can become so intellectual that we miss the details of the wonder that takes place in the script, and we miss it. So, and I just think that's a Christophany that takes place in the text, that Christ appears before is birthed, before he becomes flesh, and in the midst of that fire, therefore then shows himself up as a redeemer for the three young men. That's my personal view.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pastor.
Thank you so much. Thank you for putting yourself on the spot and answering a range of questions. I believe that there is a question from Melissa. Melissa, are you able to unmute yourself and ask your question? Thank you.
Hi, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good evening, everybody. I was just wondering, Pastor Paul, you said that, you know, some people believe that Daniel was written by multiple different authors, etc. Just out of interest, what do you think and why?
I think it's probably a hybrid of both, but I think he would have been the primary writer, and I'll explain to this in this sense. So I think Daniel was a writer himself, that's it. But I think there may have been other people who have been adapting the text, because what you get outside of what we have in this particular writing, you have other writings that we don't read in a Protestant text that's different to what we see here. And so you get a community of people who are writing, adding to it. A bit like I said about the Gospels. I said the Gospels for me was like a wake. You know, when somebody dies, you go to a funeral and they bring all the stories together. To some extent, I think you probably get a bit of that with not so much with Daniel, but you might get a bit of that idea that definitely in the Apocrypha writings, which is not the apocalyptic, the other writings outside of what we have intertestamental period writings. So I think that Daniel would have been the main writer, and you may have had people adding towards that point. Maybe some read the points were Aramaic, not Hebrew. Maybe they have been written by other parties who would witness to certain things. That's their testimony that they said, and said, here it is this right, and taking account of what he's saying. So that's just, I think you can, I think you could probably stretch to that point. But generally per se, I don't think it's a community of writers, because of A, what happens, B, the period of time which it covers in, C, the other writers that are writing outside of him, they make personal reference to him, not to a community, is put alongside Noah, Moses and David. So you wouldn't, if they say that isn't a community of writing, those are individuals, not communities. So therefore then to say that you put him alongside in Ezekiel or so, and David and does that in that sense, you wouldn't have communities and an individual, because then you'd have to then say that David was a community, that Moses was a community. It just wouldn't make sense. So I think that they'll argue certain points, but I think once you take it back down and put it back to bed, and in the clear light of day, what you see is a man recording his history and writing what he sees and what he understands at that time. And my second point to add to that, to reason why I think it's a single writer, maybe other writers might put him in place, but generally one writer. When you get at the end of the first century in Jesus' period, you have a writer called Josephus who writes the history of the Jews. Now that's one single writer, but he writes prior to Jesus, up to Jesus, and post Jesus. And he mentions Jesus in his writing. He's not a Christian, far from it, but his writings are accepted as being part of the writing that allows us to see first century Judaism. And so when you begin to put your points together, you have to then say, what's the patterns that exist outside of this that makes me see that? And that's part of I think the things that you have in those writings as well. I think lots of scholars will come and say there's lots of writers. You'll have that because in the first 5 books of the Bible, they would say that there's a collection of writers who are writing. It wasn't just one writer. And I could concede to that much more easily than I could concede to Daniel being a collection of writers. But I would say I think Daniel writes nearly everything himself. There might have been interjection from other community writers as well, but generally per se, he's a writer.
Thank you so much on behalf of Melissa. Melissa, I do hope that has answered your question.
Yes, it has. Thank you. Very intricately put.
Just got a nice little request here rather than a question. One from our Bishop Hughes. I'm going to ask Bishop Hughes if he could just present what he just wanted to say something. Thank you.
Hi, Pastor. Thank you for speaking. Yeah. You've actually mentioned several times in your talk about Daniel and where it was the last book of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of people, obviously, we have the Bible as we see it in the order that we see it. So we know, for example, Mark was written before Matthew, but it comes after Matthew.
Yeah.
It would be a good thing if the brethren could have a list of the order for how the Bible was written.
The chronological order.
They could the order of how the Bible was written, so they could see how, in terms of timescales and how the Bible was written. Is that making sense? Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, I understand. So what? 2 things. There is a Bible out that's called Chronological Bible, so it's written in a chronological order. And if you look, the chronological order starts with Job, not with Genesis. Well, it kind of mixes between the two because Job is a text that's prior to Genesis, and because when you get to Job, writing is different. It's different because Satan has access to heaven, and you don't get it, and so it's different. And in Genesis, you don't have that kind of thing taking place. So you have this earlier idea that's in place. So, but what I can do as an exercise, I can put together a chronology of how the text works, and so especially if you get to study Bible, they say in this period and that point. But there is a Bible called Chronological Bible. You can get them on Amazon, and that gives you an order. But I think somewhere in my history notes, I might have a list of scriptures as it goes historically. And also, what you could bear in mind is that, for example, some of the prophets like Daniel and Jeremiah are crossing over with each other. So they're contemporaries. And because they're contemporaries, again, example, one of the points will be is that Daniel is in Babylon, and later on sees Jeremiah. So you have this thing that's taken place, and he's prophesying, and their prophecies are saying different things that's taking place. Because one of the arguments that I have is that the reason why you see the prophecy working is because sometimes they think we should have left here a longer time ago. The 70 years finished. How come we're still here? And you get these things taking place. So some of the prophets, you begin to see Nahum and all that kind of stuff. You see all that stuff taking. So Nehemiah, you see all that things taking place. So yeah, but I'll put together a list of chronological order, and then hopefully from that, we post them. So we put everything through the app for the post for the through the our church app that we have. So the sessions we had already are in there, and we're going to add that to it as well.
Also, Pastor, just to say that in terms of the information and like the bibliography and some of the books that you are using, next week, if I have it, I can also upload it onto
we're going to upload
part of the file. Can I just, our last question would be, it's not a question, it's a statement. Would you recommend the Book of Enoch? And that's from Earl Street, and that will be our last one. Thank you.
Right. So the Book of Enoch is part, one anyway, is part of the apocalyptic writings, and it's that again is very symbolic and a lot of imagery in the narrative. I've not completely, but I know in the Coptics, for example, they'll have it, and some have it as their kind of revelation book narrative. So Enoch was part of the rights that you would have, and because of how he's seen, how his life ends out, so to say, or doesn't, so to say, you're taken to heaven. So Enoch's writings are interesting writings as well. And I think if you get a chat, I tell you what I do use, which is when I'm studying. These guys here, Harper Bell are not very. So HarperCollins are not. They're not always everybody's best friend, but I think I like the way that they kind of they have in there. They have in the intertestamental stuff that you would get, the Maccabees narrative, etc., etc. So they always very interesting historical writers as well. So that's good in there. And Book of Enoch as a separate writing I do have, and that's interesting. It is a good read. I'm not saying good read in the bad, and like a happy go to bed story, but it's a good read to understand what's happening in the mindset at that time. What were the people thinking at that time? Because you bear this in mind, apocalyptic writing is oftentimes given birth by great pressure, great oppression. So let's take COVID. We've never seen a lockdown like this before. In the first 2 months of the lockdown, the level of depression was unbelievable. In scriptural time, that would be the setting almost for apocalyptic writing to take place, because you're under a magnitude of suffering and pressure like never before. And then in the midst of this, when people are in the midst of fear and don't know what's happening, and he said, I don't know what's happening. And in the midst of that, then comes the Lord says. And what apocalyptic writing says to you, they might think, it might look like they're the winners, but God is on your side. God's going to win. Apocalyptic writing says, you might think that this is the end, but God will rise up and bring this nation to an end. The apocalyptic writing says they might stand tall as a great statue, but there's a stone coming from heaven that has not been cut by the hands of man that will bring empires to an end. Notice this in my closing point. Every single nation that ruled on a grand expanse level spoke about empires. And in the midst of the Roman Empire, Jesus spoke about kingdom. Why? Because empires are short-lived. The kingdom exists forevermore. So when Jesus speaks, he says, thy kingdom, in the prayer, teach us to pray, thy kingdom, not empire, thy kingdom come. Because God's kingdom is always a stone from heaven that was going to pull down every empire, and it will expand across the earth, and he will reign forevermore. And that's basically the summary of what we have. And remember what I said to you in the closing. What does the book of Daniel mean? It means that truth speaks to power. Truth. God, who is truth, speaks to power. And power is silenced by the truth of God. And that's what we have. 7:30.
Thank you so much, Pastor Paul. If you look within the chat, I've just said next week we'll be continuing with the book of Daniel, focusing. Can you remind us of the chapters, please?
We're going to finish up chapter 4, and then we're going to do from we'll work through 6 through. I'm going to try and finish 6 straight through to 12. next week, because it's not that deep, because there's only a couple of chapters that are apocalyptic eschatological text. The rest of them are historical narratives. So we're going to focus on those texts that we'll have. So 6, and then we're going to go towards the end that we have on here. The PowerPoints will be uploaded into our Church of God site, app. I think if you don't have the app, you should have that. If you don't have the app, let me just find the number. Let me just find
Pastor, that's fine, but that's fine. I will deal with some of that.
We have a church number that you can send a number to, and then and in that we can do that. So what I'm going to do, I'll post a number in the chat now, which you can pick up. So if you need to get it from here, 07458 303 239. That's the church's WhatsApp number.
Thank you so much.
We can do that from then.
All right.
All right. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Pastor. You're going to close in prayer.
I'll ask Sister and Foster to close in prayer for us, please.
Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for your goodness and your grace. Thank you for being with us today. We're reminded that where the 2 and the 3 are gathered, then you are in the midst. And truly today, we thank you because your presence is with us. Thank you for opening up our understanding. Thank you for the obedience of Pastor Paul to be able to break down the word so that we can hear and we can understand and move forward in getting to know you more. I pray, God, that you will continue to just speak to your people as we lie in our beds, as we go back and reflect, that you will just reveal to us what you would have us to know in order for us to live the kind of life we need to live in these last days. We thank you right now for your blessings and the fellowship that we have had tonight, and we say thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. So if you're not part of our WhatsApp link, please get the number in the
chat.
And we'll leave the chat up so you can get as much as possible, and we'll keep in contact with everybody for what's happening. So next week we can do chapter 4 and develop from there, and I'll keep in the loop for what we're doing. And we apologize when we had some links last week issues, but we've now resolved those now. So everything the previous sessions are in the app. The first 2 ones, and today will be in it also, and then going forward it will be in the YouTube and in the Zoom links as well. So thank you so much all for coming. I know you've made a sacrifice of time. We appreciate you so much indeed. God bless you. Life willing, God's spirit. See you next week.